Earlier this year, Nintendo started bringing over Game Boy and Game Boy Advance titles on the Switch Online service. And at the height of this, people have been demanding that the classic Pokemon titles to be brought over to the service. But the chances of that happening are not very likely. Why is that? Well, that's going to be explained in this video, so stay tuned. For the past several years, Nintendo has been offering some of their classic game titles as part of the Switch Online service. They started with the NES Online service, where Nintendo would essentially drip-feed some of their NES games on the Switch Online service, leading to a handful of titles offered. Then they started offering Super Nintendo games, where they would also drip-feed some of those titles as well. And then, when Nintendo introduced the Switch Expansion Pass, they started offering Nintendo 64 games. Now, just this year, Nintendo announced their online service apps that offered Game Boy and Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance titles does require being subscribed to the Switch Online Expansion Pass, while the regular Game Boy titles is offered through the regular Switch Online service. Still, however you may feel about the way Nintendo offers their classic titles for the Switch, there is one thing people have asked for in the wake of the Game Boy offerings, and that is the classic Pokemon titles. Now, of course, they did offer the Pokemon trading card game that was on the Game Boy Color, as well as the Pokemon Stadium titles have also been brought over to the Nintendo 64 service, but with one very big omission. It does not have the transfer pack features that the original Pokemon games had. And yes, I'm talking about those Pokemon games. The mainline entries, specifically Gens 1 through 3, with Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow, Gold, Silver, and Crystal, and in the case of the Game Boy Advance, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. There's been a number of people hoping for these games to come to the service. After all, Pokemon has been a bit of a staple for their handheld line, but well, I'm gonna be that person and say straight up, it's more than likely not gonna happen. So why do I say that? Why do I think Nintendo would not bring over these classic Pokemon games over to the Switch Online? Well, there is one reason for that, and one reason, a big reason for that, and that is cloud saves. Back when Nintendo first announced their online service, which was when cloud saves were first being implemented, it was announced that not every game was going to support cloud saves. These included Splatoon 2, Animal Crossing New Horizons, and most importantly for this video, all of the mainline Pokemon titles. That includes Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, Sword and Shield, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Legends Arceus, and Scarlet and Violet. The reason for this limitation is the simple fact that cloud saves are exploitable, something that can lead to cheating, which is not something that Nintendo wants. But in the case of Pokemon specifically, there is one major reason why Nintendo doesn't allow cloud saves for those. And that reason involves the ability to clone your Pokemon. Now, you see, when using cloud saves on your Switch, you can essentially have two different save files that's on two different systems. And this is especially exploitable for the case of Pokemon, as if you have an extra save on a different system, well then you can transfer said Pokemon to another file, whether that's through Pokemon Home or to another game, like, say for instance, you go from Sword and Shield over to Scarlet and Violet, or Brilliant Diamond over to another Shining Pearl game. And well, that is not something that the Pokemon Company wants you to do, as that does fall under the category of cheating. So the option of cloud saves has been disabled for that very reason, meaning that if you ever want to transfer your Pokemon save onto another system, then you gotta do it manually through the Switch options. This may be simple for Nintendo to disable with their separate Pokemon save files, but with their Game Boy Switch Online, that is a whole different can of worms. As, well, Nintendo's online apps for their classic games are basically their own streamlined emulators for each system that they run on. Like, I kind of imagine back during the Wii days, during homebrew stuff, it's kind of like putting your own emulators for that. Nintendo's online apps are sort of their own official equivalent to that. And every app for each of their classic systems operate under one platform, and that is essentially where they would trickle out their own digital ROM files that would run within the app itself. And as a result of that, any classic game that they include would all be tied into their own custom streamlined emulators. That includes, for instance, the ESRB rating. And, well, case in point with that, the Nintendo 64 online app has been rated T by the ESRB. This is due to the inclusion of Winback, which was given a T rating due to the inclusion of it. And because of this, everything released within the online app has to be given a T rating, even a game that is as child-friendly as Kirby. With everything tied into one app, this also means that every save file from within each game that you use is all going to be tied into one app, which basically thrives off of cloud saves. This means that the Pokemon games would not be included in the online service, as that would mean disabling the cloud saves for the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance services altogether. And considering that these were made purely for members of the Switch Online service, I don't think Nintendo is willing to do something like that. The only way the Pokemon games would ever logically come to the Switch Online is if either Nintendo reworks their cloud saves entirely, or the Pokemon Company would have to find ways to implement systems that supports cloud saves, but still has a way of preventing cheating. Like, I don't know, maybe one example would be that the Pokemon Home app could have an update where if you have two different Pokemon with the same Pokemon ID, then that Pokemon cannot be brought over, and even apply that to when trading Pokemon in-game as well. But even if they were to do that, they'd also have to rework the ROM files of the classic games as well. So that might be hard to do as well. This also wasn't unique to the Switch Online service, as Nintendo and the Pokemon Company has pretty much always been trying to prevent users from cheating and cloning their Pokemon. It was a similar situation that happened with the 3DS Virtual Console, as that did eventually get Gens 1 and 2 of the Pokemon games released over on that system. But they had to disable the 3DS Virtual Console restore points for those titles specifically, as having that is more likely going to lead to cheating. But the difference here is that those were actually released as individual games, and so for the Switch Online, they would all be tied into the Game Boy and Game Boy Color apps. So such a workaround of that nature would not be that simple. Unless Nintendo finds a workaround of that nature, the only way I see the classic Pokemon games being brought over to the Switch would be either through its own separate thing, like maybe a dedicated separate app for classic Pokemon games that doesn't allow cloud saves, or maybe they would offer these games separately on the Switch eShop, or maybe in the form of a collection, in much of the same way that we got Mario 3D All-Stars. These are really the only ways I can see the classic Pokemon titles ever coming to the Switch, but anything within the Game Boy Online app that they have is very unlikely due to its usage of cloud saves. But that, of course, is my own personal observation. But what do you guys think? Would you have liked to see the classic Pokemon games come to the Switch? And do you think there's other ways that these titles could still be released for the Switch, and even other ways through the Game Boy Online service? Let me know in the comments below, and subscribe to DSL Media for more content. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.